vengeance that consumes every part of him. He starts hunting apostles. He nearly kills Casca's would-be attacker in front of her while she's catatonic. He becomes, functionally, a weapon that used to be a person. This is the part people skip when they're making their highlight reels. The strength montage doesn't show you that Guts is running on rage and guilt with the emotional processing of someone who never had the chance to develop it. It doesn't show you that he pushes away Farnese, Serpico, Isidro, people who are trying genuinely to help him, because vulnerability reads to him as danger. It doesn't show you that his body is falling apart from the recoil of his own weapon, that he's in a state of near constant physical damage, because rest was never modeled to him as something you're allowed to need. There's a scene, one of the quieter ones, where Shirke, the young witch traveling with his group, essentially diagnoses him. She says his hatred isn't strength, it's a kind of self-punishment disguised as purpose. And this lands different than any fight scene, because it's the story itself telling you, this isn't the ideal. This is a wound wearing the costume of willpower. So why does this matter for anyone watching who isn't, obviously, a fictional swordsman fighting demons? Because the pattern underneath it is extremely real and extremely common, especially among people who get praised for their grind. The pattern is, someone experiences real pain, gets no support in processing it, discovers that productivity or aggression or overworking gives them a temporary sense of control, and then builds an entire identity around never stopping, because stopping means feeling the thing they never dealt with. From the outside, this looks like discipline. It gets you promotions. It gets you compliments. It gets you a fan base, if you're a fictional swordsman, but internally, it's not resilience. It's avoidance wearing very convincing armor. The tragedy of Guts as forged under conditions of total abandonment and expecting it to function normally in a life that has, presumably, actual options. That's the first crack in the whole idea. You can't extract the discipline from the source code that produced it. Now here's where it gets more interesting, because Guts does eventually get something good. He finds the Band of the Hawk. He finds Casca. He finds, for a brief and genuinely beautiful stretch of the story, something that looks like belonging. And what does he do with it? He leaves. Not because it's bad for him. The story is explicit that this is one of the only times in his life he's actually happy, but because some part of him can't tolerate being anywhere he isn't actively proving his worth through combat. He tells Griffith, essentially, that he needs to know he can stand on his own, that he needs a dream of his own and not someone else's. On paper, that sounds like healthy individuation, right? Very find-your-own-path energy. Except watch what it costs. That departure is one of the direct triggers for everything that follows. Griffith's spiral, the eclipse, the sacrifice of the entire Band of the Hawk, Casca's assault and mental collapse, Guts losing an eye and an arm. I'm not saying it's his fault. The show is very careful not to make this a simple morality tale of his flaw caused the tragedy. But it is showing you, in brutal detail, what happens when a person's entire self-concept is built on never depending on anyone, never staying anywhere that isn't earned through suffering. The one time he tries to build an identity, it detonates the people around him. And after the eclipse, this is where the never give up reading really falls apart if you actually pay attention. Guts doesn't recover. He doesn't process what happened to him, or to Casca. He mechanizes. He gets a literal cannon arm prosthetic, and a mechanical hand designed for killing, and he sets off on what the story calls, without irony, an act of pure. There's a moment in Berserk where Guts is standing in the rain, covered in blood that isn't his, holding a sword bigger than most people's entire bodies, and he looks completely empty. Not triumphant. Not powerful. Empty. And that image, more than any fight scene, more than any never give up montage, is the actual truth of who this character is. Everyone quotes the wrong part of his story. If you've spent any time in anime spaces, you already know Guts. Black swordsman, survivor of the eclipse. The guy who fights a demon god with a sword strapped to his back that's practically a slab of iron. He's become shorthand for resilience, the go-to reference for no matter what life throws at you, keep swinging. People put his quotes over gym selfies. They tattoo the brand of sacrifice without knowing what it actually means. He's been flattened into a motivational poster, and that flattening is exactly the problem I want to talk about. Because Guts isn't a resilience icon, he's a case study in what happens when a person never processes trauma and instead converts all of it into forward momentum. And the show doesn't hide this, it's actually screaming it at you for over 300 chapters. We just tend to stop listening once the swords come out. Let's start with where he actually comes from, because context changes everything here. Guts is born from his mother's corpse, hanging from a tree after she was killed. He's raised by a mercenary band, sold into a man's bed at the age of 9 by his adoptive father, and given his first sword, quite literally, before he's given any kind of childhood. His entire framework for existing in the world is violence as the only reliable language. Not violence as a tool he picks up. Violence as the first and only thing anyone ever gave him that worked. This is important because when people say be like Guts, what they usually mean is have his work ethic or have his refusal to quit. But they're importing a mindset that was. People misread the character, honestly, because in a story this violent, it's easy to assume the violence is the point. The action sequences are incredible, they're some of the best in the medium, and it's natural to want to extract be strong like that from them. But the strength on display in those scenes is never actually framed as the solution to anything. It's framed as the symptom. Every single arc where Guts is purely defined by combat and vengeance ends in him losing something else. His body, his relationships, his ability to be present with the people who love him. The arcs where he actually grows are the quiet ones. The ones where he lets Casca hold his hand even though it's the mechanical one. The ones where he stops pushing Isidro and Farnese away out of pure reflex. If you're building a personality, or a work ethic, or a whole identity around I will endure anything and never stop, it's worth asking the question Berserk eventually forces Guts to ask himself, even if it takes him hundreds of chapters to get there. Endure it for what? Toward what? Because pure endurance without direction, without rest, without anyone allowed close enough to actually help, that's not a life. That's a holding pattern. That's someone circling the same wound at increasing velocity and calling the speed progress. The character is genuinely one of the best written examples of trauma in fiction, precisely because the story refuses to let his suffering become simple inspiration. It makes you sit in the cost. It makes you watch what obsessive self-reliance actually does to a person's body, their relationships, their capacity for joy. And it slowly, patiently, over an enormous number of pages, shows you the alternative, not weakness, not giving up, but the much harder and much less photogenic work of letting people in. So if this character means something to you, and again, a lot of people genuinely see themselves in him, because a lot of people have had to build, aspirational, by huge chunks of the audience. That should tell you something. When two opposite extremes of a coping mechanism both get turned into merch, the problem probably isn't the individual character. It's that we're really bad, culturally, at recognizing trauma responses when they're dressed up as ambition or grit. So let's talk about what actually shifts things for Guts, because this is the part that almost never makes it into the highlight reels, and it's honestly the more interesting story if you slow down and watch it. It's not a bigger sword, it's not a stronger enemy to defeat. It's Casca's slow return to awareness, and specifically, it's Guts learning, badly, clumsily, with a huge amount of resistance, how to be patient with someone else's pain instead of just his own rage. Caring for her doesn't give him a dopamine hit the way killing an apostle does. It's slow. It's frustrating. It requires him to sit with helplessness instead of converting it immediately into violence. And the story treats this as a genuinely harder battle than any of his physical fights, which I think is the whole point. The real antagonist of Berserk's back half isn't a demon. It's Guts' own instinct to isolate, and whether he can be talked out of it by people who simply refuse to leave. Farnese is a great example of this, actually, because her arc runs almost parallel to his. She starts as someone using cruelty and control as armor for her own trauma, and over time, in watching Guts, in caring for Casca, she learns to soften without becoming weak. The show is very intentionally showing you two different responses to pain sitting right next to each other, one that calcifies into isolation, one that slowly opens back up, so that you can't miss the contrast. Guts isn't given a villain to defeat that solves his internal problem. He's given people who stay, and the question the story keeps asking is whether he'll let that matter more than the sword. I think this is why so many psychological state through how he treats his own body during this stretch. He barely eats, barely sleeps, doesn't get his wounds properly treated, and the cannon arm itself is basically a weapon that damages him every time he uses it. He is, quite literally, hurting himself in the process of trying to hurt the things that hurt him. That's not subtext. That's the actual mechanical design of the character during this arc. Now compare that to how real burnout tends to look, stripped of the fantasy elements. Someone goes through something they had no support processing. A breakup, a layoff, a family collapse, doesn't matter what, and instead of grieving it, they throw themselves into something that gives them a sense of control. Work, gym, a side hustle, whatever the outlet is. And for a while, it looks incredible from the outside. People say things like, wow, they really turn their pain into fuel. They get promoted. They get admired. Nobody in that story is asking whether the person is sleeping, whether they've cried once in the last 8 months, whether they've let a single person get close enough to see the parts that aren't performing. The tragedy of Guts is a slowed down, mythologized version of exactly that pattern, and it's worth noticing that the fandom's favorite panels are almost always from the part of the story where he's at his most disconnected. We like him most when he's at his worst, because his worst looks like strength if you don't know what you're looking at. There's also something worth saying about Griffith here, because the two of them are basically inverted mirrors of the same core wound. Griffith takes his pain and turns it into an ambition so absolute he's willing to sacrifice everyone who ever loved him to achieve it. Guts takes his pain and turns it into a vengeance so absolute he's willing to sacrifice himself, piece by piece, to sustain it. Neither of these is presented as admirable by the narrative, even though both get treated as isolation, the vengeance, or the refusal to rest. It's the much less cinematic version. Keep moving forward, sure, but let people carry some of the weight with you. Because in the story, the sword never actually saves him. The people who stay do. And maybe that's a better thing to put on a gym wall than a quote about never giving up. Let's actually sit inside that eclipse sequence for a second longer, because I don't think it gets enough credit for how deliberately it's constructed as a psychological turning point, not just a plot event. Before the sacrifice, Guts is already showing signs of what I'd call productive avoidance. He trains obsessively. He picks fights he doesn't need to pick. He treats his body like a tool to be sharpened rather than a thing to be cared for. The story is quietly setting up a person who has never once asked, internally, what do I actually need right now? Because that question has never once been safe to ask. And then it takes the one structure that gave his violence a purpose, the band, Griffith, the found family, and annihilates it in front of him while he's powerless to stop it. It's almost too on the nose if you think about it as metaphor. The exact moment he's forced to confront how fragile everything he built actually was, he doesn't get therapy, he gets a warhammer and a plan for revenge. Of course he does. That's the only tool he's ever been given. What's fascinating and genuinely well observed by the writing is how the story treats his vengeance arc not as a triumphant power fantasy, but as a slow-motion self-immolation. Every apostle he kills doesn't heal anything. Casca doesn't get better because Guts is stronger. Griffith doesn't stop existing as a source of pain because Guts cuts down enough demons. The math doesn't work, and on some level, Guts knows it doesn't work, which is why the fights start to feel less like victories and more like a man trying to outrun a feeling he can't outrun. You can almost track a character, and I do think it's a genuinely well-constructed tragedy. This isn't a criticism of the writing, is that the narrative keeps giving him chances to actually heal, and for most of the story, he keeps choosing the sword instead. Not because he's weak, because healing requires sitting still with something unbearable, and he has spent his entire existence learning that sitting still gets you killed. Here's the part that I think gets missed the most though, and it's actually the most important part of the whole arc if you're paying attention long term. The story does eventually show him changing. Slowly. Reluctantly. Through people who refuse to leave even when he pushes them away. Casca's recovery arc, his relationship with his and Casca's child, the moments where he actually lets Farnese patch him up instead of walking it off, these are treated as the real victories. Not the kill count. Not the size of the sword. The moments where he lets someone in without immediately punishing himself for it. That's the actual lesson, and it's the opposite of what gets circulated online. It's not endure everything alone and you'll become unstoppable. It's the isolation and the self-destruction were never the strength, they were the injury talking, and the real growth starts the moment you let someone see you're hurt. So if you're someone who resonates with Guts, and a lot of people genuinely do, because a lot of people have their own version of the world gave me nothing so I built myself out of spite, I gently push back on the idea that his path is something to aspire to. Admire the honesty of his pain. Admire that the story doesn't sanitize what trauma actually does to a person. But don't mistake his coping mechanism for a blueprint. He survives the eclipse. He doesn't survive it well, Those are two different things, and the show spends hundreds of chapters proving it. If there's a version of being like Guts worth taking from this, it's not the themselves out of very little. Take the part of the story that's actually being offered as the lesson, not the isolation, not the vengeance, not the idea that your worth is measured by how much you can take before you break. Take the quieter thing sitting underneath all of it, that the sword was never what saved him. The people who refused to leave were. That's a much harder thing to put in a highlight reel. It's also the only part of the story that's actually true.